is essentially related to these coordinated ebbs and flows of capital asset prices and crises worldwide. And the literature has mainly identified the shifts in US monetary policy and changes in global risk appetite as its main drivers. But there is also some recent literature that essentially underscores the potential role of commodity prices also as an engine to the global financial cycle. So what we do in this paper essentially is to tell a story about how commodity prices enter in this narrative. And for that, let me start by showing you some charts that are going to serve as a motivation for the work that we do. So on the left, you have the evolution of export prices and GDP, and I'm showing you cross-sectional averages for the 54 countries in our sample. Now, we're going to use export prices as a key summary statistic for how commodity prices affect small open economies. We have an entire paper about this. But it's essentially justified by the large share of commodities in total exports. And what you see here clearly is that GDP and export prices have been pretty much moving in tandem for the last 30 years. Now, to the right, you have the evolution of capital inflows and outflows against export prices as well. So first observation, inflows and outflows are very highly correlated and also very related to export prices. So all in all, we can basically say that commodity price fluctuations are playing a key role in driving both the dynamics of business cycles and capital flow cycles in emerging economies. Now, let's look at the side of more risk measures. So on the left, you have the evolution of the BAA spread against capital inflows and outflows, and you can see how related they are to global risk. And on the right, you have the MB spread, and in red, there is basically the fitted value of the MB spread, where the MB spread is fit with two global factors, export prices and BAA spread. And what you see essentially is that these domestic spreads are largely explained by the factors. So can you still hear me? Okay, cool. Now, putting things together, if we look how export prices and the BAA spread relate, in the chart on the left, you don't see very much of a correlation. However, if you look at the chart on the right, it is important to note that changes in the BAA spread tend to precede changes in export prices. So you see there the negative of the lag change in the BAA spread against the change in export prices and how correlated they are. So essentially, these two legs of the global financial cycle related to global risk and commodity prices are clearly interrelated. Now, what we do in this paper is to basically try to pin down what drives this movement. And is it that commodity prices are a source of shock? Or is it that commodity prices respond endogenously to global shocks related to the global financial cycle, and this is driving this movement, or a combination of both? Now, for clarity, let me just use this flow chart that is going to make it very clear like what we do and where we stand. So on the top, what you see is that in our world, we're going to have commodity-specific shocks and US monetary policy shocks and shocks related to shifts in global risk appetite. Now, in the center chart, you see how one of these shocks, so the commodity-specific shock will affect directly commodity prices. The US monetary policy shocks and the global risk appetite shocks is going to affect directly global financial conditions. Now, in the center of this flow chart, you see how everything is clearly very much interrelated. So changes in global demand, we know, generate increases in the demand for commodities, pushing up their prices. Shifts in financial conditions have a potential impact on interest rates. So lower interest rates can trigger higher demand for inventory, leading to higher commodity prices. At the same time, it's been shown in early literature on oil and agriculture how changes in commodity prices can also affect global demand. And if this generates inflation, can lead central banks to intervene, basically shifting global financial conditions. And this has a direct impact on export prices, business cycle, domestic financial conditions, and capital flows. Now, when we look at the data, everything is interrelated. And what we're trying to do in this paper is to kind of go down the identification of the arrows going from the shock to all the domestic variables to see what is essentially driving the movement that we observe. So what we do is to examine the role of the impact of commodity price fluctuations in emerging markets. And we're going to basically distinguish between the effects of commodity prices as a source of shock and the role of commodity prices in global loss transmission. So for the latter, we're going to basically frame our analysis in the usual drivers of the global financial cycle, mainly US monetary policy and shifts in global risk appetite. For identification, we're going to use a panel local projection with instrumental variables. That is not going to be your usual local projection, as following the work by Clone, Jordan, Taylor is going to be extended to include interaction effects that are going to help us to unpack some of the channels of transmission. And what we find is that it is important basically to clearly identify these shocks because the mechanisms of transmission are going to be very different. So we're going to identify shocks related to exogenous shifting in commodity prices using a proxy for major commodity market events that are unrelated to the state of the economy, so weather event, geopolitical events, natural disasters, and so on. And we're going to use the BAS spread as a global financial cycle indicator. And we're going to instrument it using a US monetary policy proxy and risk shocks proxies. Now, what do we find? We find that commodity price shocks originated essentially in idiosyncratic events in commodity markets drive emerging and developing economies' business cycles with more limited effect on capital flows. In turn, East global financial conditions are essentially related to expansions and to procyclical movements in capital flows. And commodity prices actually respond a lot to these global shocks, transmitting shifts in global financial conditions to emerging markets. But we find that not all the shocks, the global shocks, are transmitted equally. And in fact, the magnitude and channels of shocks related to the BAS spread stemming from US monetary policy, all shifts in global risk have different effects and are transmitted through different channels. Now, playing a bit with unpacking this heterogeneity, we uncover essentially two main channels of transmission. One that we're going to call the financial channel, which operates through movements in the MB spread, and a commodity channel that is going to operate through movements in export prices. So what we find is that on top of the baseline effect, endogenous fall in MB spreads essentially play a very important role in amplifying the impacts of commodity shocks. So in countries that, in the event of a commodity shock, have a larger reduction in MB spread, expansions are larger. In turn, the endogenous response of export prices propagates and magnifies the impact of US monetary policy, and the endogenous fall in MB spread amplify the impact of shifts in global risk appetite. Now, in terms of how do we enter in the literature, obviously, our work is related to the papers that analyze the impact of commodity prices on business cycles, also the literature that looked into shifts in the terms of trade and capital flows in emerging market. We extend this analysis by providing a link between export prices and reduction in borrowing cost, the so-called financial channel that we unpack that has been the focus of other literature. in terms of the global financial cycle drivers, we want to think that this paper essentially broadens the debate about the role of commodity prices and the global financial cycle, but we also speak to those papers that have looked at US monetary policy and shifts in global risk. And all in all, as a byproduct of our analysis, we also offer a new perspective of potential factors that can contribute to the heterogeneity in the global spillovers of US monetary policy. So other papers have looked at other effects. We look at commodity prices. So for the talk, I'm going to jump briefly into the data and research design. I'm going to talk about the transmission of commodity price shocks, the transmission of global shocks, go very briefly through additional results and robustness, and then look into the heterogeneous effects by investigating the channels of transmission. So we're going to use annual data, so for 54 countries that are emerging and developing. So we have across all the spectrum, upper middle income, low income, and middle income. The macro data come from the usual suspects sources, no surprises here. Something I want to highlight about the data is that we extend our earlier work and essentially construct our own measure of export prices. And this is done by combining information on commodity prices, producer prices. These are going to be a weighted average of these prices where the weights are given by the export share, which is time varying. And we compute our export prices following the indications of the IMF export and improved prices manual. Then what we do is to estimate a local projection that is going to have the ingredients of your typical local projection. So you're going to have the dependent variable that we are denominated with y. We're going to have the intervention that is going to be essentially for us, say, one standard deviation increase in export prices instrumented with our commodity instrument, or one standard deviation decrease in the BIA spread instrumented either with proxies for US monetary policy or proxies for global shocks. So that's F the intervention, country fixed effect. We're going to have in X a bunch of additional controls, so real GDP growth, PX growth, the BIA spread, net capital inflows, and the last term that you see basically at the end of the equation, so I'm going to just point it here, is basically this extension that Chloe, Jordan, Taylor proposed, which basically is not usually seen in the conventional local projections. And this basically allows you for an interplay in the intervention and control variables, with the idea being that the intervention can modify certain variables, and the way that these other variables behave can ultimately also have an impact on the outcome. So, going for commodity prices and export prices, why export prices? So, because primary commodities account for a very large share of total exports in MDs, and as you know, commodity prices are much more volatile than producer prices, so they dominate the overall variation in export prices. This has some advantages, which is that allows to account for changes in the export specialization over time. So we've seen over our sample that some countries became net exporters of commodities that in the past they were net importers, vice versa. So the shares that we use are time varying. And in a panel setting, estimating the average effect of a commodity shock can be challenging because it requires essentially that you put the countries in homogeneous categories. It's not very obvious. But, well, we are estimating sort of an average commodity price shock. So having said the advantages, the disadvantages, that the approach makes it a bit difficult to know if some commodities are playing more of a greater role influencing MDs than others. So, as I said, to identify the commodity shocks, we're going to construct an instrument. This instrument is basically based on careful work on examining historical documents and newspaper articles to find events characterized by substantial, and by substantial, I mean double-digit price changes related to geopolitical events, natural disasters, or weather shocks. So, for instance, in '93, the source of shock was Clinton environmentally friendly policies. Timber prices increased like 40%. So a type of event like this is going to serve as for our instrument for those countries that export timber. So how do we construct this instrument? So our instrument ZI is defined by the following equation where, strictly speaking, is a metric of surprise. So for each event that I showed you, each of the 24 events, we compute a measure of surprise that is given by the price of a given commodity at time t minus the expected price in t minus 1 for the commodity at time t. That is the year of the event. And we're going to obtain this expected price in t minus 1 by, we use a linear regression with lags of the value of the commodities and also prices of the commodity the given commodity C does not belong. This is to control for global factors. So for, say, an energy commodity, we're going to use the price, say, of agricultural metal overall indices. And, this way of doing things basically is assuming that, most of the variation around the time of the event is going to be driven by the event itself. And we, remember the export prices are a weighted average of the price and the weight. So the weight that you see there as a W is going to be essentially the export weight of a commodity associated with the event at a given country in T minus 1. And we set a threshold of 2% for this event basically to be meaningful. It is, that's W under bar. Now, let me show you a bit how this instrument works. So here in the x-axis, I'm showing you the instrument against the change in the price of exports. So for countries, Cameroon is in blue and Trinidad and Tobago in red. So you see here there are a few events, but what is interesting to note is that there is a lot of cross-sectional variation. That is basically what is helping us for the identification. If you look at 1 year, 2019 is the year in which US became a net energy exporter. You can see how well the export price tracks the instrument. And finally, if you see all countries and all events, we get quite a powerful instrument. So in the local projections, we're going to instrument the intervention, the change in export prices, with this metric of surprise. And what do we get? We get a local average treatment effect. So in the top panel, you see that the commodity shock leads to an increase in export prices, pushes up GDP, typical terms of trade effects, the real exchange rate appreciates. We find that there is a decline in the policy rate. The MB spreads also go down. When we look at capital flows, there is an increase in reserves, a bit of action on outflows, not much action on inflows, and on the net, there is you have a reduction in net flows. When we look at the composition, we see that there isn't much action coming for portfolio inflows. Most of the action is coming from capital outflows in the other investment category that is mostly bank related. So that is to say, we don't see all this massive movement between inflows and outflows that we observe in the data. So the role of commodity shocks on capital flows is much more muted. Our reading of this is that it doesn't always pour when it rains, using the title of the paper by Kaminsky, Reinhardt, and Weg. Now, what about the shocks more related to the global financial cycle? So for that, what we do is to look at US monetary policy shocks and shifts in global risk appetite. For US monetary policy shock, our instrument is going to be the principal component of a number of US monetary policy proxies. And for global risk appetite, we have two instruments. One is uncertainty shocks. based on the price of gold around major geopolitical events from Piffer and Potowski, and also uncertainty shocks in US financial markets taken from Ludwigstone, Ma, and NG. Now, what I'm showing you here is the combined effect. So, of a change in the BAA spread, US monetary policy instrumented is shown in blue, shifting global risk appetite in pink. So there are a lot of similarities. So GDP expands, there is an increase in export prices, the real exchange rate appreciates, which is the counterpart of the dollar weakening. We have an increase in the policy rate, the MB spreads go down. But if we look a little bit closely for a moment, we see that there are actually some differences. So the global risk shock in pink, we can see that it has more of a spike-like pattern, kind of reverting more quickly. If you look at the MB spread, how it goes down quite a lot and reverts very quickly. And in terms of capital flows, there are some non-trivial differences. So if you see for the global risk shock, inflows and outflows mostly go up by the same, and you have both an increase in inflows and outflows. And on the net, it's almost unchanged, it's almost around zero. While for monetary policy, you have not much action on inflows, quite a bit of action on outflows, and on the net, they go down. Now, when you look at the composition, you see that perhaps unsurprisingly, but it's cool to actually see it, is that you see a lot of action on portfolio flows, both inflows and outflows, which you don't very much see when you look at monetary policy. The action on other is somewhat similar. So now we do some additional results on robustness. I just want to emphasize one, which has to do with, we spent a lot of time thinking about identification, and it's very tempting, and you see this in the literature, that people tend to think about export prices being exogenous for small open economies. So you plug the export price, and that's your shock. What we say here is this is basically similar to just not bother about the instrument and just instrument with OLS. Now what happens? Happens that it depends what you want to do and what the goal of your shock is to explain what. But these export prices are going to mix up effects that have to do with endogenous responses of commodity prices and exogenous effects. And if I do less, and you can see this here in pink, some stuff remains more or less similar. But the impact of capital flows, not at all. And you see that you find massive increase in inflows, for instance, by doing OLS. And this is not driven by the commodity shock itself. This is basically the global financial cycle. So don't use PX alone. We omit events. We omit one country at a time. We do subsample analysis post-2000. We analyze events associated with energy. Results mostly hold. Now, let me just go over the sensitivity to specific channels, unpacking the heterogeneity in the transmission. We ask 3 questions here. How important is the financial channel operating through MB spreads in the transmission of commodity price shocks? How important is the financial channel for global shocks? And how important is the commodity channel for the transmission of global shocks? And to do that, basically, we take advantage of the paper by Cloyne, Jordan, Taylor, and you see in purple that I have added a term there that is the intervention times capital theta times little theta f. And this interaction term essentially tells you how the effects of the intervention are going to be mediated through movement in PX or DMB. And essentially, capital theta is going to capture the sensitivity of the variable of interest, that for us is either PX or DMB, to the intervention. And for those with a micro heart, this is an example of the the differences between what is a direct effect of an intervention, that's your typical local projection where your interest is beta, and unpacking these indirect channels that is basically the purple shown in there. Now in practice, what we do is we need to estimate this capital theta, so we basically follow Cloyne-Jordan-Taylor and estimate this theta tilde in using a local projection, where theta here is going to be either the MB spread or PX. This is the variable of interest that we want to estimate to tease it out from this regression, and this is intervention instrumented. So think of it as a first stage that then gets plugged into the other regression. And consistent with the rest of the estimation, we convert capital theta in deviation from its mean. And the identification assumption here is that there is heterogeneity in the responses across countries owing to reasons such as economic structure, institutions, whatever it is. Now, what we're going to focus on in the interest of time is just in the GDP response. And this is just to show you in a simple way how this gets unpacked. So we're going to construct hypothetical scenarios in which basically here is going to represent these different scenarios. And essentially, the reaction of the variables that generate this interaction is going to deviate by k units from the average response. And we're going to use, we need to use something. And so we're going to use kappa going from minus 1.5 standard deviations of capital theta estimated before to kappa equal to plus 1.5 standard deviations in capital theta. And what do we get? So first, how important is the financial channel for the transmission of commodity shocks? Very important. So this is the average response on the left, and on the right, you see with the MB spread going down, so this is minus 1.5 standard deviations that I showed you before in kappa, in green, and actually the red, the plus 1.5 coincides with actually a tightening of the MB spread, so a larger endogenous fall in the MB spread amplified the effects of a shift in PX. And this is statistically significant. How important is the financial channel in the propagation of global shocks? Here you see that for the US monetary policy shock, the shifts in GDP from higher reductions in MB and lower reductions in MB are not statistically significant to each other, but they are for the global risk appetite shock. So the larger endogenous decline in the MB spread amplifies the propagation of the global risk appetite shock. And finally, commodity prices and global shocks. So on the right, you see the GDP response in green when export prices go up by more, follow the US monetary policy shock. And here you see the GDP response to global risk appetite when export prices go up by more, 1.5 standard deviations in the theta, in green. And you see that when they go up by less, for the global risk appetite shock, it is not really statistically different. So the action is going through US monetary policy. So that is to say that commodity price increases amplify the propagation of monetary policy shock, and the impact is statistically significant. Now, to conclude, basically, what we did here is assessed how commodity prices affect MDs, and we took the stance of looking at the role as a source of shock, and their shock in transmitting the global financial cycle through an endogenous response. We find that MDs domestic business cycles show high vulnerability to commodity price shocks, but capital flows display less sensitivity. So the good news is when it rains, it doesn't always pour. But at the same time, we find that export price changes are pivotal in global shock transmission, especially US monetary policy. And we find that these are associated, both shocks related to the transmission of the global financial cycle are associated with a procyclical response of capital flows. But when we think about the procyclicality of everything, it seems that a lot of that story sticks more to the shifts in global risk, especially when it comes to capital flows. So when it rains, it does pour in that case. Now, what's next, and it almost speaks to itself, I already have the paper for next year conference. We're working on a follow-up in which we're looking at commodity prices and the fiscal cycle of MDs, particularly the role of financial markets and institutions. So putting the story of fiscal policy here, how it responds, and also analyzing that from the lens of a theoretical model with optimal policy. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you to the organizer, especially Nicolas, for having me at this conference. It's been always a pleasure to be here in Pretoria. I'm happy also to discuss these interesting papers. I'm going to summarize my discussion around 3 points. To begin with the first point, I think Luciana gave a nice presentation, but let me summarize what I understand from the paper. The paper aims to understand the role of commodity prices, shock, and global financial shocks in explaining co-movement in business cycle, but also export price and capital flows, but in addition, spreads in emerging and developing markets. And they use quite a large sample of countries. For causal inferences, they use IV to identify the two main classes of shocks. The first shock is instrumented with some specific events, and this is something very remarkable work, using events on the key class of commodities. And then for global financial shocks, they use US monetary policy shocks, and then risk appetite. So the main finding, the way I read the paper, is that the global financial shocks are important. It's a good candidate to explain the co-movement between business cycle and capital flow in emerging markets. So for me, that's an important, whereas commodity price shocks cannot explain. And to me, this is the major contribution of the work. In terms of this fact that she presented, so you see that the outflow and inflow, the inflow-outflow, they're moving the same direction. Then you see the spread with the negative co-movement. I think that the paper can replicate, and to replicate this, you need the global financial shocks. You cannot replicate this with commodity supply. And to me, that is an important insight. To start the discussion, maybe first the evaluation. I think this is a very nice, interesting paper, timely, and very, very relevant. As we know, a large number of countries are commodity dependent. And then we also know from the demand side, the emerging markets that are growing, and also advanced countries, they account for the major demand. So this is an important topic, and I think, and they try to really model the issues. The paper is well written. There has been a lot of citation connection with the literature, and I really enjoy reading. And the contribution is to start with the narratives, because they build a database. So to collect, I think, a lot of information about this. I think this is going to be a new data set to be used by a researcher, I assume. And also they do causal inference and try to show this positive co-movement in the flow can be explained by the global financial shocks. I like the paper a lot. Congratulations. So let me start my discussion. I was a little bit puzzled by this data on GDP. I couldn't find the Great Recession in the data. I think it's the deviation from the trend, the blue, the red, and it did not pronounce. Maybe you have an explanation for that. Yes, so as I said, the important contribution is the building the data on events, but also it would be nice to connect this with the recent bunch of work by Geert Persmans and co-author. He has been developing deal tools for agriculture shocks and food shocks. And there I think you may also pick up some events, because I was surprised that you only have 24 events, where Persman has quite a lot of, I think, events. And maybe here, if I may preview the result, they show that agriculture shocks is contractionary, so the increase in price of agriculture, food, is contractionary in advanced country, in emerging market, but it's expansionary in low-income country. So you may want to discuss this and connect very much with your work, I think. Then also during your presentation, I think you did a great job. But in the paper, I think the demand component of commodity was not very much discussed. And maybe indirectly, and you cited Alquist, but I think it would be nice to discuss this, and also in your analysis, by explicitly try to find, to estimate in your model directly the role of commodity demand and how this affects the co-movement you try to explain. And the last question to continue is to have a complete characterization of your finding. I find it personally important and interesting to tell us some story about how advanced countries are responding to these shocks, because this is a key to understand the transmission mechanism. So then here came my own work that I've been doing the last 10 years with Otroc and Morimont. We've been trying to study these topics, especially commodity, by running a number of VAR, but also at the end, I think we succeed in developing a general equilibrium model, full-fledged, where we analyze commodity endogenously, but also financial factors endogenously. So this gives us, I think, a tool to try to compare endogenous versus exogenous driver of commodity, and then also of commodity exporter. And we are able to analyze the model with South Africa and Canada as commodity exporter. And then we use the global, whatever it is, to explain the transmission of global shocks. And then in this new tool, we are able to develop 3 channels. One channel we call the World Commodity Channel, which help us to understand why some shocks being demand have more impact on commodity. And this is important to understand the transmission. And the second channel is also the domestic commodity supply channel, why the same commodity shock, for instance, has a big effect on country A versus country B. This goes with your heterogeneity. And then finally, we have the financial channels, which allow us to understand the financial sector as amplification, but also as a source of shock. So the model can be summarized with this picture. We have households. It's very symmetric. It's very transparent. So it's allowed to understand. The red is the financial. The black is the domestic. And then this blue light is the global. Okay, within this framework, we can learn a number of things that may connect to the work. So here I look at commodity supply shocks. Commodity supply shock is a shock that increases world commodity prices and decrease commodity supply. And then this shock is contractionary in the world, but it is expansionary in South Africa. So this shock then is candidate to explain a negative co-movement between business cycle and commodity exporter and then and commodity importer. To me, this shock is close to your shock commodity supply. And then, if you see the way policymakers respond in the world, this is an advanced country, interest rate increase. And to me, this is potentially a channel through which you may have your capital outflow that you displace in your result. Now, when we compare it with your work, we see here the capital outflow increase, and we don't have any effect. So in our case, commodity supply is a good candidate. Commodity supply shock cannot explain the positive co-movement, and also it cannot explain the positive co-movement with inflow and outflow. So that's the first conclusion. And now when we look at the demand shock, the demand shock is a shock that is happening outside commodity. This shocks and this creates a positive co-movement between business cycle and exporter and then also importer. And then this shock potentially could explain, given the response of interest rate, could potentially explain maybe your capital inflow, although in our paper we have not examined this point. To go on an extent, I think I learned from Miranda, Ricco, and Ray paper that already with the monetary policy shock and also in our work, we study monetary policy shock, which is driving commodity demand, and you mentioned this. So I would like to come back to my story. Already in the work, they see that monetary policy shock is affecting capital flow, but in a symmetric way. So maybe by capturing this additional shock directly in your work, you may be able to clarify the role of global financial shocks. Heterogeneity, you did already a great job, but maybe you may want to investigate institution, which may matter. So following some talk this morning. And then in our work, we study heterogeneity by studying domestic commodity supply, which is pinned down by a parameter that we estimate. So let me conclude here because I'm running out of time. So a great paper, I very like it. Interesting contribution. Discuss more the result with all the points I try to raise. Thank you.
Can I upload the slides again? Because there is some stuff that is here that could be useful. Okay. Good. So thank you, Romain, for your discussion. Really, I appreciate it a lot. So on the GDP, yeah, you got it. So it's detrended. You see the kink going like the drop, but this is a cross-sectional average of 54 countries. There is a lot of heterogeneity, so bear in mind that many emerging economies also, in a way, were not that affected by the global financial crisis in the same way as other advanced economies, so there isn't really much of a surprise there. On Pearsman and the picking up of some of the events, we do use most of the events that coincide with our time frame. Now, because we use the MB spread, we unfortunately have to start our sample in 1990, and that's where they started. So in the prequel to this paper, we use data from 1980, and we use much more of those events. But I think we cite Gert and co-author quite a bit, but we are restricted by this. On the role of commodity prices and the global financial cycle and how it relates to the literature, so maybe in the interest of time I went a little bit quicker, but a lot of these papers like Davis and also Sylvia Hélène basically find that there is this for global factor that is correlated with global risk. So this is the global financial cycle. And there is this second factor of capital flows that is correlated with commodity prices. So it's not clear what this correlation means. Is it commodity prices the source of shock or the endogenous response to the global financial cycle. So we find that is the second, actually. And that's the additional twist that we provide in our reading of the literature. In terms of how do advanced economies respond to our global shocks? Yes. So for commodity prices, the issue is like this. You have a terms of trade that is a ratio of export and import prices. The terms of trade can move because export prices move, because import prices move, or there is a not perfectly offsetting movement in both. In our reading, export prices tend to be more important for emerging economies because of the high exposure in the exports of commodities. We haven't done it, but a simple look at how this looks for essentially advanced economies will basically tell you that there isn't so much action going on there. So now obviously the chart that I want, it doesn't come up. But anyhow, essentially what we observe is that most of the action for advanced economies would come from import prices, not for export prices. Do we have we done it? No. Why? Well, for the economies that we have in our sample, it's very natural to move to yearly frequency, just for data limitations. With advanced economies, not so much, and there is a little bit of a methodological issue on the construction of the import and export price indices, but we're thinking about adding that on. In terms of your own work, it's super interesting, all the insights that you mentioned. I just want to do like a brief clarification. We don't distinguish between commodity supply shock and commodity-specific demand shocks. The reason being is that we believe that this would not really matter so much for the economies that we are analyzing. Why? Think about a commodity-specific supply shock, a weather event, whatever, that produces this effect in global markets. So there is destruction of a given commodity, prices go up, quantity go down. What happens in your domestic market that is a price taker in any of these countries? Demand goes up, right? And so basically, you know, higher price, you're going to have a demand for producing more in the local market. Same effect as commodity-specific demand. In the global market, whatever geopolitical event generates a commodity-specific demand shock, how it affects our small open economy is going to be the same. So we don't do this distinction. We don't think it's essentially relevant for the question we are answering here.
Luciana, let's take some questions, and then
okay.
if you want
So,
to tell us more.
Okay, sorry, okay, no problem.
In the interest of time, because we have 10 minutes left and perhaps have questions.
Thank you, Luciana. Mine are not very deep questions, I'm afraid, but I just wanted to clarify two things. The first one, I was a bit maybe surprised to see the way in which you approach the monetary policy identification. So you take this principal component of various measures, and it's not obvious to me why you want to do that. So I just wanted to, you know, if you can share thoughts on, you know, why that's a good idea, because I'm missing it. And the second point, again, is not very deep, but I was kind of, so you have a very large sample of countries, potentially very heterogeneous, and you run a panel fixed effect estimator to get your estimates. And we know that if the heterogeneity is very large, in a dynamic setup like the one you have, you may have biases coming from this pooling. And so I was wondering whether you guys tried alternative approaches like, you know, mean group estimators, where you get, you know, you would address this concern. Just a curiosity if you had a chance to do this. Thanks.
You want me to reply? It's okay? Yes? Okay. So thank you, Ambrogio. So essentially for the monetary policy, the reason is, I mean, it's not really very deep neither. So we found that the monetary policy proxies, some are at a given frequency, higher frequency, lower frequency. Some are available for given years, other years. So essentially to maximize the sample that we have, we basically took the first principal component of all the available process that we had at hand. Regarding your second question, no, we haven't done what you mentioned, but one thing is that, yeah, there could be heterogeneity. Some countries may be exporters of one commodity exposed to others and so on. We tried to smooth out the outliers when they were cleaning up the data, but we haven't done anything beyond that. Now, something that is relevant, at least for the identification of the commodity-specific shock, is that we actually leverage on this heterogeneity for identification. So the different exposure, both at the cross-sectional at the time dimension, is serving for this purpose, but we haven't gone beyond that.
So actually I have a quick question. So you have these 40-ish events on commodity prices, and they are from very different commodities. You might have one for energy, one for cocoa, so you expect very different countries to react, and they're assuming that they all react roughly to the shock in the same way. I was wondering whether you explore that sort of level of heterogeneity.
So yes,
yeah. And the other question I have is just a clarification on the charts. So you have a shock that looks like a permanent increase to commodity prices. And then, given this shift in level of commodity prices, GDP starts going off on a trend. Is that a feature of the fact that you take first differences in your local projection, or is something you thought about? Or?
So,
thank you.
Okay, so in terms of the first question, was about the, short-term memory loss.
The commodity price shocks, the AVUs, and whether there's a...
Yeah, so essentially, that's a very interesting question. Like you're saying, it could be that some events associated with agriculture may look different than energy, may look different than others. So we have the problem that for agriculture and metals, we don't have enough cross-sectional variation to achieve identification, so I cannot tell you like how they look like. But we have enough heterogeneity for energy, which we do. And the results look very much alike, but we cannot do a complete assessment based on that. But now, we are quite comfortable with the results, because when we omit events, omit countries, one at a time. So coming back to your point, Ambrogio, if any of the countries would have been driving the results, when we do the omit a country at a time, would look different, and they don't. So that's good news. In terms of the persistency, so GDP, basically, we look at the, we take the results as there is a lot of persistency in the way that it reacts to essentially the commodity shock. And if you see, so for the other shocks, you see that the profile of export prices, say in response to the monetary policy and of GDP, the profile is quite similar to this hump shape. So essentially for us, this hints that a lot of the transmission of the US monetary policy is happening through export prices. But,
Any final burning question? So if not, let's move to